This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello. Hi, it's Fiona Salt here. I'm hoping everybody can hear me loud and clear. Thank you. So obviously this is my first show this evening, and I am pretty nervous actually, in spite of the fact that all we do all day long is talk for a living. This one is a little bit of a new experience to me, so I'm hoping that everything is going to go all right. I am one of those teachers who, unfortunately, as soon as I have to do anything that involves technology in the classroom, I suddenly become completely and utterly inept. So yeah, I'm the teacher who can't work the DVD player, can't work the video player, can't work the whiteboard, and usually has to rely on somebody else to do it for me. So I am here, as is the dog. Okay, so we have Gilbert the Cavapoo, who is going to be my co-host for this evening. Gilbert will not allow me to be in the room on my own. So if I tried to shut him out, he'd only scratch on the door anyway. So he is here to keep me company, and we just have to hope that the doorbell doesn't go, because otherwise we'll all know about it. Anyway, so this evening we are going to be talking all things poetry. Now, if you are not an English teacher, don't let that put you off. We're going to be talking about why poetry is important and why it's important in the modern world. In spite of the fact it is often kind of put to one side, pushed to the back burner, people perhaps think that it is quite an elite art form, and that perhaps it is only associated with white dead men. Hopefully some of the discussion that we have this evening will allow us to dispel that myth and make us think about why poetry is an important art form. I think it's amazing. Obviously, I would say that because I am an English teacher, but I also have the kind of joy of being involved in a competition that takes place every year. And this is going to be one of the guests that I'm going to be talking to this evening is Dr. Julie Blake. And Dr. Julie Blake is the director of a competition, a recitation competition called Poetry by Heart, which I've been involved in for quite a few years now. And I've had the good fortune of coaching some students who have got through to the finals on a couple of occasions. And equally, another guest that we have this evening is one of those former students. So Emily Cox is also joining us. Emily Cox was a finalist, I think it was 2015, if memory serves me right, and she got right the way through to the finals of the recitation competition. So Julie Blake is going to be telling us a little bit about Poetry by Heart, and we're going to be thinking about why we turn to poetry in times of great joy or in times of great sadness. So even if you are not somebody who particularly, I don't know, recognizes themselves as somebody who really likes poetry, you will often find that, you know, if at a moment of great sadness, at funerals, for example, there will usually be a poem read. Equally, you know, at weddings, there will be a poem read. So there must be something about the power of words and the power of poetry that transcends, that talks to all of us. I think that over the years, students actually have engaged with poetry a little bit more than we might imagine. A few of you may have heard of a poet called Kay Tempest. Now, Kay Tempest she was on one of the stages at Glastonbury, so writes poetry that is an art form, is meant to be read out loud. And I won't be reading poetry to you very often, but I do think that this one is a particularly powerful poem, and it's called 13. And I think this poem could be used in so many PSHE lessons. It could be used as a starter activity. It is not just about English lessons where these poems can be used. So I'll just read it to you because it is quite quick. So it's called 13. The boys have football and skate ramps. They can ride BMX and play basketball in the courts by the flats until midnight. The girls have shame. One day, when we are grown and we have minds of our own, we will be kind women with nice smiles and families and jobs, and we will sit with the weight of our lives and our pain, pushing our bodies down into the bus seats. And we will see 13-year-old girls for what they will seem like the first time. And they will be sitting in front of us, laughing into their hands at our shoes and our jackets and rolling their eyes at each other. While out of the window, in the sunshine, the boys will be cheering each other on and daring each other to jump higher and higher. So I do think that's a really, really powerful poem. And I think as a starter activity, that could be an amazing opportunity for discussion about gender conventions, about the way that girls and boys are perceived differently in childhood and as they grow into adolescence. So I would love to hear about your favourite poems or poems that perhaps have had an impact on you in your life. It doesn't have to be a well-known poem. It can be a poem that perhaps you remember from childhood or you remember from your own studies. So what we're going to do at the moment is I'm going to invite Julie Blake in to call in the next couple of minutes, and she is going to talk to us about Poetry by Heart and why it is such an amazing thing for young people to get involved in. So if I could ask Julie to call in for us, and I will just play an advert.
Introducing Amanda Davey. Amanda is one of the first specialist teacher assessors for dyscalculia in the UK and offers dyscalculia tutoring and bespoke training for schools. With 26 years of teaching and tutoring experience in the UK, Amanda offers specialist online tuition focused on building confidence and developing skills. Amanda also offers online and face-to-face training on dyscalculia for educators, informing practitioners as to how to identify children that may have dyscalculia and how to support them in class. Find out more about Amanda and what she can offer you at www.amanda-davey-dyscalculia.co.uk.
Okay, so I think if I'm just going to press this, I'm hoping this will allow Julie to join us. Possibly not. Julie, could you just try again for me? I know you said you're dialing in. Okay. Okay, well, just as we're waiting for Julie to dial in, I'll tell you a little bit about her. So Dr. Julie Blake is the director of Poetry by Heart, and it was set up in 2012, and it was set up in conjunction with Sir Andrew Motion. Okay, you're hitting it. Thank you. I just don't seem to be able to get you to join at the moment. It did happen originally. Okay, just try one more time for me, Julie. See, I knew if there was technology involved, it was going to be me that broke it. Okay. I think I need quicker reactions, obviously. I'm hitting all the buttons. This is going really well. Okay. This is not happening. Okay, right. I'm trying to also think of things to say at the same time as well. I'm trying to make sure I don't miss the phone call. Okay, so Julie Blake, I know Julie, well, actually, we went to the same university. And even though we weren't there, our paths didn't cross at the same time. We have quite a lot of memories of the same places, and we went to the same kind of dodgy nightclubs. We went to Hull University, and we went to the same clubs, places called Spiders, which was in a bit of a dingy dungeon type area, and then places called Silhouettes, that was another one, the Welly. So all these kind of dodgy clubs where we both went to at the same time, dodgy chip vans, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, we didn't actually meet when we were at university. It was only when I got involved in Poetry by Heart that we realised that we'd gone to the same place. And then Julie has kind of gone onwards and upwards and has just finished a doctorate at Homerton College, Cambridge. And she is now an expert in 20th century poetry anthologies. Unfortunately, still not able to hear her at the moment. Okay, we do have a second guest, so maybe if we try and get Emily Cox to see whether Emily can join in, and hopefully we can come back to Julie Blake later on in the show. So Emily, do you want to try and give us a call? Yay. Hi, Emily.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Oh, thank goodness for that. How are you?
I am very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So Emily Cox is one of my absolutely wonderful former students. Now, Emily, you're doing a master's now, aren't you? Are you in Edinburgh? Is that right?
So I've just finished my undergrad. I'll be graduating in July. It's a complicated process in Scotland. You have to do it for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a change of direction academically, so I've actually been there for 5 years. So it is a Master of the Arts, but that's what they call it in Scotland for an undergrad. So
Absolutely.
Not
well, we're going to call it that anyway. You're a master's as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so oh, you've been blocked. So Dr. Julie Blake is now saying she's been blocked. That is unfortunate. Okay, well, hopefully, if she logs out and logs back in again, we might be able to get back. Oh, here she is. Oh, I'm getting everybody at once now. It's like buses, isn't it?
Is she? Oh, there we go.
Hello, Julie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Thank goodness for that. I've got you both at once now. That is good. Okay, so Julie, do you want to, we'll come back to you in a little minute, Emily, if that's all right. So Julie, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Poetry by Heart initiative?
Yeah, sure. Poetry by Heart's 3 things, really. It's a curated collection of poems that exists free for teachers to use on our website. And those are collections of poems for children in Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, and we have a collection for everyone older than that, Key Stage 4 and 5, which is the one we started with. Then it's also resources for teaching and learning about poetry, all kinds of different things, and it's the National Poetry Speaking competition that you've been involved in. And it's very simple, really. It boils down to 3 things: that children choose a poem, they learn it by heart, and they perform it out loud. And on one level, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and then on another level, it is far more complicated than that, isn't it? Because I think so much of it is in the name, isn't it? So Poetry by Heart, I think when you think sometimes about memorizing poetry, it is often that kind of learning it and perhaps not taking on board the kind of real meaning behind it. And I think the Poetry by Heart competition, for me, and I know for the students who've got involved in it, it is really about loving that poem, isn't it? And that is why it is something that is by heart. It kind of becomes part of who you are.
Yeah, definitely. It's about kind of the really good performances are where the young people just own the poem. It's theirs. And one of the things, as you'll know, that's really fascinating in the competition is when you get a number of young people in the same heat doing the same poem. And at first they kind of panic and go, no, they're doing my poem, and it is my poem. And then they quickly realize through watching and listening that every one of those poems is different. And we think that we're onto something really interesting here, that what you see when someone performs a poem that they've learned by heart is a kind of embodied literary criticism. When you're talking about a 7-year-old, that's something different from an 18-year-old, but that each one of those is an act of interpretation and taking the poem in and then giving it back out in their own special way.
Absolutely. So what made you want to kind of set it up in the first place? I know you were involved with Andrew Motion, was that right?
Yeah, I was at the time I was the education director of the Poetry Archive, which is a website archive of recordings of poets reading their own work. And Andrew had been to see the Minister for Schools about various things, and they'd had a conversation about a competition like this. And Andrew was telling me, and I said, I think it's a great idea. I really believe that poetry should be spoken, it should be heard, it should be shared, it should be something that lives between us, between the speaker and the listener and the poet. And I just thought it was a great idea, and it started from a kind of conversation like that on the way to a tube station.
Wow. So have you been, because obviously when I first started getting involved with my students, it was more the older students. Was it 14 plus when it first started?
That's right, yeah.
How do you think it kind of moving into the younger year groups. Has that changed it in any way? Have you been surprised by how the younger students have reacted to it?
I wouldn't say surprised, because I really didn't know what to expect. And I've been, all of the whole team, we've just been absolutely delighted. The younger children are, that whatever rules we have, that they don't apply in the same way. And we set this up for 14 to 18-year-olds for a number of reasons. One was that was my own teaching background. So I was more confident with that age group. It was also that we knew of a competition that had been running in the United States for many years, and that was the year groups that they did it with, or approximately. So we wanted to kind of parallel it in a way. But it was also coming out of a concern that what happens in poetry during the exam years does things to poetry that aren't necessarily much to do with poetry. And we wanted to help to keep doors open in the House of Poetry to all different kinds of poems. So it started with a particular kind of remit. And then the Department for Education have supported us with funding, and they were very keen that this time around, the last couple of years, that we should expand that to Key Stage 3 and to Key Stage 2. So we did. And it's been really interesting what's happened. The Key Stage 3 has become the biggest area of the competition. Key Stage 2 is still growing, and the younger children bring a different energy to it. What you can get with a student in Key Stage 4 or 5 is often a really accomplished understanding of a sophisticated poem. We had to choose different poems, and that was a huge amount of fun, choosing poems for younger children. And we're still working on that. But also they bring a different energy. They dress up. There's yes, some of my favourite performances are in costumes. You don't really get many 17 and 18-year-olds dressing up in.
No.
And they just the spirit and life in it is different, and it's wonderful. And they're all of the different age groups sort of do it differently, and they're all charming and wonderful. And they're all owning the poems in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, on it, I can't praise Poetry by Heart enough, because, from a purely selfish level as a teacher, it is one of the most wonderful experiences I've had as part of teaching. You just feel like it's so uplifting and moving and powerful, and in spite, some of the poems that you hear are really quite sad. But you're just surrounded by this level of kind of enthusiasm and enjoyment and joy at the spoken word. I just think it's an absolutely wonderful experience. I just wonder whether we could bring Emily in. And Emily, you could tell us a little bit about your experience.
Hello, hopefully you can still hear me and I'm coming through okay.
Hi, Emily, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfect.
I think there's a bit of a gap between when I start speaking as soon as I unmute it.
We have a bit of satellite delay.
Yeah, no worries.
So if you could tell us a little bit about Poetry by Heart, if you can remember. I know it was a few years ago now, but obviously you were amazing and got through to that final. Your rendition of a poem called Train will stay long in my memory, because it was really very powerful and very moving. I just wondered what you gained from doing the competition, and whether it was all you expected or whether you surprised yourself in any way.
Yeah, so I mean, at the time, getting involved in that sort of competition, I was merging two of my passions at the time, which was poetry and performance. I was a drama student as well. So it was a very exciting opportunity to be a part of it. I'd never really been involved in a competition around poetry or literature that wasn't just submitting my own work. And even then, I didn't make it very far. Hopefully, any of my poetry will never see the light of day. But I got to choose from such a great collection of poems, and the poems that have stayed with me even since the competition, all female authors that I picked, female poets, and like you said, Train, very dramatic poem, very emotionally driven poems, and I think that suited me in the sort of things that I was looking for in poetry at the time. But yeah, no, I got to choose those poems and learn them by heart and perform them. And like you said, I was very fortunate to win at the regional competition and get to go down to Cambridge. And it was a fantastic experience. In terms of actually, going through the competition, it's quite the jump to go from reading and analysing a poem like you might do in an English literature class to then, using my own voice to convey that understanding that I've got of the poem to other people in a performative way. But that was the traditional form of sharing poetry long ago, memorizing and then reciting to groups. And I feel like I was getting a taste of history in that competition. Loads of young people would learn, got a real sense of the poetry, being able to share that, inhabit those poems in a way as well. And I have very fond memories of that experience, of talking with interesting, like-minded peers who shared a love or at least an interest in poetry, which was rare for me at the time. I didn't have many peers in my social circle really who I could discuss or share my passion for poetry with. And I suppose that's the beauty of a competition like Poetry by Heart, because it brought together a variety of people who were all there to celebrate poets and poetry and performance.
Yeah, it was really diverse, wasn't it? And I think it was a World War One showcase, wasn't it, the year that you did it?
So the train poem was part of that as well, I think, if I remember rightly, talking about the train on the platform leaving and hoping that the train wouldn't start and then didn't have to take the loved ones away. It was very emotional.
Can you still remember it, Emily? I won't make you recite it. But can you still remember?
I can remember saying, "God, please don't let the train start," over and over. But I think watching other students as well, the young people, being a part of that was more enjoyable for me than performing it, just getting to see it as well. I can imagine just being an audience member for the day, just getting that real sense that people are really enjoying what they're saying and what they're doing. And it was a really great experience.
Fantastic. I mean, because the poem that you did, it was a pacifist poem as well, wasn't it? Which I think what it did was gave a different perspective on World War One poets, which is often very male dominated, and this idea of hearing a female voice from the time, I think, was really powerful. So if I could bring Julie back in, how do you go about choosing which poems you're going to put into this anthology? Do you feel that you are crossing over into making it diverse enough for the young people that you are trying to attract?
Well, there's lots of things that you've asked me there, but the how do we do it? Well, I always work with poets or people who are particularly expert in an area of poetry. So I'm working at the moment with Jean Sprackland and Daljit Nagra, who are both very fine poets, on refreshing the collection for Key Stage 4 and 5, because it's the one we built first and we think it could be improved. And we're looking with that at the moment, particularly at adding poets who have been published in the last 10 years and younger voices. And we always pay attention to diversity and always have. Obviously, when you're doing historic timelines of poetry, that gets more difficult the further back you go because of reasons of social injustice over time. But so we're adding some very exciting new voices. But the First World War collection was quite interesting because we set out at the beginning with a very deliberate agenda to mix things up a bit, and to not just do the same 7 poets that appear all the time and the same 7 poems often. So we started by adding more women poets, and there's quite a lot of women poets in that collection now. We added contemporary and modern poets writing back to the First World War, so you had these sort of generational perspectives. We've added most recently, we've added an Indian poet, an African Caribbean poet, an African American poet. So we've also added poets who wrote in languages other than English. And Fiona, of course, you were there on our historic tour of the First War battlefields.
Absolutely.
Where we had young people reciting poems at the graves of the poets, at the sites that inspired the poems, in French, in Polish, in German, as well as in English. And that was quite an extraordinary experience too. And that came out of that collection of poems and the way that we wanted to mix it up.
Yeah, that truly was an absolutely amazing experience, hearing those young people, and so many people stopped and listened and got involved. It was awe-inspiring, actually, and I learned so much about history by doing that, kind of the forgotten soldiers of World War One, and visiting kind of different cultures. I do think it's not just about poetry, is it? It's about history, and it's about culture, and it's about diversity. So much more than just the written word. So, Julie, I know you've done a lot of work with the anthologies, and has that been your doctorate? That's been what you've been working on, researching poetry anthologies in the 20th century. Is that right? The school ones?
It's separate to Poetry by Heart.
Yeah.
The things sort of have their connections and their synergies, I think is the word.
Yeah.
But my doctorate was looking much more specifically at, well, the question was, what did the national curriculum do for poetry? So I looked specifically at poetry within the GCSE assessed curriculum, the exams, and so the national curriculum came into being in 1988, and I took my study up to 2018 because you have to stop collecting data at some point. So first of all, I collected every anthology that an exam board had specified in that 30-year period, which meant I had to read every single exam specification of all of the awarding bodies. It was a lot of exam specifications.
Yeah.
And then I had to actually collect them. So all of the Amazon secondhand booksellers became my best friend, and I was buying these historic school anthologies for like 1p, and they were apologising that they had writing in, and I was going, no, that's really good, that's really helpful, thank you, because then I can see what the students wrote. So I had to collect these 100. It turned out it was 100 books, and I collected them all, and then I looked at what poems and poets basically I looked at what happened to anthologies. I looked at what happened to poetry in the national curriculum, the changing national curriculum orders over that point. I looked at the tension between statutory power, the power of the government to direct what poetry was set for GCSE, to set the parameters in the curriculum orders, and what agency the profession in the form of the awarding bodies had, and how it was quite interesting. Sometimes the government would say, you must, these are not you must, I don't think they ever said you must teach these poets, but they had these name list of poets, and they would say, these are the poets that are suitable. And then some of those never, ever, ever appeared in an anthology set for GCSE. So we tend to have a narrative that these things came top down, but actually when you actually look at the patterns of what actually got done, not what was specified, it's much more interesting and much more of a sense of professional agency in it.
That does sound really interesting, actually. So you went right back, how many, 30 years, did you say?
30 years, yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I probably will have been doing my own GCSEs. It was, is Moon on the Water an anthology?
Yes. Yeah, that's
what year was that from?
Relatively recent.
I wonder if that's from when I first started teaching, or
that's not the earliest. No, that's relatively recent.
What are some other names? What other of anthologies?
Well,
what are some of the 1990s ones?
Well, some of the ones specified in 1990 were published in 1970 or something. So some of them are quite curious. There's a very, very famous series of anthologies called Voices, which I think is still in print, but it's now marketed as anthologies for Key Stage 3. And there was one called Worlds, which a few years ago I was at a conference and Simon Armitage was talking about how this was the anthology he'd studied at school. Often these older anthologies, before the national curriculum really bit in, they often had like really beautiful photographs in them. Worlds had photographs of poets, and Simon Armitage talks about how he saw pictures of Seamus Heaney, like photographs of Seamus Heaney, where Seamus Heaney was down the pub smoking a cigarette, and he kind of looked at this and kind of thought, well, this poetry can't be all bad then.
Yeah, if you can go to the pub and still write poetry, it must be onto a winner.
It's all right.
So do you think that the anthologies reflect time? Do you think that they reflect the diverse nature, the way that British society has changed? Do you think that's reflected in the way that they've been put together?
Uh, well, yes, I suppose some things did. One of the changes that happened was that in 1993, women were invented. Um,
Wow,
it's
that's amazing.
Yeah,
Were they alive as well?
Yeah, some of them were. The anthology that Simon Armitage talked about had absolutely no women poets in it, and in the earlier phase of GCSEs, you could have a set text that had absolutely no women poets in it at all. Although, so that's interesting in terms of the women. Now it's absolutely incomprehensible that you could do that, and even with the most recent statutory order for GCSE that we must all be studying representative romantic poetry. One of the ways in which awarding bodies have interpreted that is to kind of go back and say, well, who were the women poets? And to include poems by Mary Lamb, which is a slightly odd choice because Charlotte Smith was a romantic poet who was massively influential on people like Wordsworth. She sort of brought the sonnet back into English poetry, and yet she's not in any of the GCSE awarding bodies. So sometimes these things are a bit strange. But then if you look at other changes in British society, well, in those early anthologies, often there's exemplary treatment of poetry particularly from the Caribbean. And that was coming out of the Swan Report, which was a government inquiry into, in the language of the time, into the underachievement of Afro-Caribbean children in Britain, the sort of the children of the Windrush generation, children I was at school with, and the Swan Report was a big report, and one of the things that it said was that all aspects of the curriculum needed to be looked at, and if people couldn't find themselves in that curriculum, then why would they engage with education? So some of the debates that we're having now are strikingly familiar when you actually look at the curriculum history. This isn't new, and this brought out a lot of interest in poetry, particularly from the Caribbean. And there were books in my collection of 100 that were published in Jamaica, where and they came over and were recommended. They weren't set in quite the same way that the anthologies are. They were recommended for GCSE, and that came out of a whole mesh and a network of things. There was a teacher exchange scheme going on between Jamaica and London, where a teacher from London would go and teach in Jamaica for a while, and vice versa. So these sort of passage of books that had been prepared for Jamaican young people came into Britain. So there's some incredible work that was there. However, these books didn't have the same status as the anthology now. The anthology, you have to do it, and it has a required element. Obviously, COVID's changed that slightly, but a required element. Whereas this was one book on a list of 15 books, and if a teacher didn't want to touch it, then they didn't have to. The thing that really changed that was when the NEAB, which was a precursor of AQA, introduced a thing called Poems from Other Cultures in one of the anthologies, and then that was really influential on what happened after that. So it did change over time in interesting ways, but there was a more openness in the early period and more variety to choose from.
That's really interesting. So do you think that actually we've taken a step back?
The curriculum, one of the things that is there in my data is also the massive change in the ecology of poetry in schools. So I did a lot of number crunching in my doctorate, and at the beginning of the period of 1988, if you look at all of the poets in all of the books that were recommended by all of the awarding bodies, there were in 1988 1,039 poets whose work was represented.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that every teacher knew the work of 1,039 poets, because we would all have died if we had, because that's been a lot. But now, or in 2018, not now, but in 2018, there were just 73 poets' work represented across all 4 awarding bodies.
Wow, that's
So,
gosh, that's amazing, isn't it? Really? And they were repeated across the different awarding bodies, so you'd see the same names appearing and
yeah,
reappearing.
of course, but it went from 1,039 to 73, and the number of poems took a similar tumble at the beginning of the period. I can't remember the numbers; I couldn't find them just before I came on air. It was something like 7,000 poems in 1988, and in 2018 there was something like 130, something like that.
Gosh, that's really quite sad, isn't it? Really, because I think I'm just looking at a couple of comments here as well that we've got. So Megan said, any ideas on how to bring a love of poetry into the classroom? The GCSE anthology is always met with a groan and very quickly dropped when it became optional thanks to the pandemic adjustments. Any thoughts on that? This kind of idea that, I know I'm asking you just part of a discussion, a general discussion, Julie. Do you think that poetry is met with a groan? Do you think that the GCSE anthology does little to help that?
Well, I remember doing a piece of work some time ago for one of the awarding bodies where they said, "Can you find out what boys read?" And I went and found some boys, and they were all boys who had not done well in their GCSEs, or hadn't even done them in some of the case. And I talked to them about what they thought of the books they've been presented with in English. This wasn't just poetry, and they said, "Well, they said." I don't want to read something that my brother read the year before. And I think there is something of that these anthologies tend to be around for quite a long time.
Mm,
And as teachers, we prepare, and then you want to teach that to another class. And although I totally buy the argument that for every class that should be a new experience, it's new poems, they haven't read them before just because I have. But I thought that was a really interesting perspective, that our older brother, had read it, and they'd looked over their shoulder and they'd talked about it, and they sort of knew what they were going to get. And one of my favourite anthologies in my collection was one that the pre-runner to OCR used to set, and it was called Touched with Fire. And it's dated now, but it was a good anthology. And what OCR used to do is they used to rotate it every year. So if it had 8 sections in, then this year section 1 was available for examination, and next year section 2 was. Now I don't doubt that put that increased demands on teachers, and perhaps every year was too much. But there was an idea that this was rotating and changing, and I think that the anthologies have become very static.
yeah. No, I agree with that entirely, because I do think, there is that sense of groaning, the Power and Conflict anthology, and the kids kind of go, oh, sick of, I hate poetry. It's those words, isn't it? I hate poetry. And you just think you can't possibly hate all poetry. It's that kind of idea that perhaps there's more that we can do. I don't know whether there's more that we can do contextually, or more that we can do to make them perhaps feel this sense of, as you said before, recognizing yourself within the poetry. I do think that's really important, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the things that I really like about Poetry by Heart is that although we make these collections available for the competition, the starting point is young people choosing a poem for themselves. And I think that having a bit more involvement in that, a little bit less of a kind of route march through someone else's favorite reading, I think is important. And for teachers too. When I was teaching, there was more latitude. Well, so perhaps not at GCSE, but at A level, more latitude to teach what you loved.
Yeah, I think that's probably a little bit still there at A level. I think that the main joy for me of teaching A level is that kind of, when you do the NEA and the students are allowed to choose. I mean, in our school, I know some schools do kind of direct them a little bit, but in our school, we give them completely free choice on which poet they want to look at. And then they look at it through a particular critical lens, so a Marxist lens, or a post-colonial, or an eco-critical. And you do find that the students then can really care about what they're writing about. But obviously at GCSE, that is far more problematic, because you're having to deal with sections and subsections and trying to, which poem works best with another poem. And those poems weren't written to be compared, and they weren't written to be connected, because they were written in so many different time periods by so many different people with so many different influences. And yet we try and shoehorn them into fitting together, working together. We need to write about them, under this umbrella. And I do think that makes things difficult as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be more interested in where the poets have actually been connecting to other poets, or other, where they're responding to a poem written by someone else, so that where there are sort of organic connections rather than sort of putting strange things together. But it's a hard job picking poems that will work for a whole nation of children, and that's where it's certainly in the earlier times, where in the GCSE history, where there was more scope for teachers to put their own collections together that would suit their class better. There was more elbow room to do that. So it's not just a history of changing anthologies, it's a history of changing assessment practice, and that changing assessment practice has moved much more in the direction that one size has to kind of fit all, and that makes it it increases the consistency that you can get. If every child's being assessed on the same kind of, more or less the same body of poetry, then you can control it more. But there's gains and losses with every choice that gets made like that.
Yeah. So Mal has said kind of songs and raps are poetry. I wonder what you think about that, Julie. Do you agree?
Well, there's a question that we could probably debate for about three weeks. So I'm going to bottle out of answering that question, but I'll refer you to a very fine book on poetry called On Poetry, which is written by the poet Glyn Maxwell, who is one of our judges. And he talks about this and says, and his opinion is one poet, but he says that the surround of poetry, silence, and the surround of a song is music, and that therefore the two things are quite different. And I don't quite know where I stand on this yet, but I think that it's an intriguing idea that the surround of poetry is silence.
Yeah. So you've allowed in Poetry by Heart students to correct me if I'm wrong, have some of them written their own poems and performed them this year? I know things have been slightly different with the way you run the competition during lockdown and school closures.
Yeah, well, the direction we've taken it in is not to have any impediment to taking part in performing a poem aloud. So we have a category. It's not the main competition. It's a kind of a showcase for people who want to share poems they've written. So we have had some of those, but and quite a few of them in this year's entry have been poems that students have written. We didn't set this in any way, shape, or form, but poems that they've written about their own experience of the pandemic. That's been quite a theme, and it's been incredibly moving to hear those poems.
Yeah. How have you found running the competition during this time?
Well, I think I started with mental and physical elasticity, and I think I have none of it left.
None of us do.
Just twisted and turned and changed and turned on a sixpence so many times all year that there's none of it left.
But you're still doing your celebration, aren't you? Is it in the Globe?
We are having a finalists event. Last year's finals event was supposed to happen at the Tate Modern in last March, and I think 3 days before the event, the Tate rang me up, and I thought that they were going to be ringing me to tell me I hadn't got enough public liability insurance in case a student ran off with a piece of art, which I thought was somewhat improbable. And so I was bracing myself for this. No, you need another £1 million of insurance. And they said, oh, we're terribly, terribly sorry, but we're closing today, and the event won't be going ahead.
Oh.
And if I'm honest, despite the fact that we had done all of the work for the event, for all of our finalists, I've never been so relieved in my life, if I'm honest. I had vision of being responsible for a super spreader event.
Oh my goodness.
But it was both awful, and because we then had to turn on a sixpence and entirely invent a new way of judging the competition without actually having students present, but we did that. And the finalists event this year was also supposed to happen in March, but obviously it wasn't lawful to do that. So then it was going to be in April, and then it was going to be in May. And then we thought, well, we might as well leave it until after the 21st of June. So it's on the 19th of July. It's at the Globe, because we also figured if we did it outdoors, it might have a better chance.
Of course.
Better chance.
Yeah.
And of course, the Globe is an absolutely amazing experience. So we've just got all of our fingers crossed at the moment that the Delta variant isn't going to put paid to our finals, because we've got last year's finalists and this year's finalists all coming along for a big celebration of their achievements in speaking their poems.
Oh gosh, that'd be amazing. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to play the news, and then hopefully I'm going to come back, and I would like to ask both Julie and Emily, I'm going to put you both on the spot a little bit. I'm going to ask you whether you've got a favourite poem or a poem that really matters to you, which might be quite a difficult question. So, and also there's a couple of questions about how to register for Poetry by Heart. So I'll play the news and then we'll come back to those couple of questions.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Tom Hopkins-Burke.
This is Tom Hopkins-Burke with your weekend Teachers Talk Radio News. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has warned that measures to help children catch up on lost learning could arrive too late. IFS researchers stated that if new spending is only announced in the autumn, the actual measures could be delayed well into 2022, potentially too late to effectively make up for lost learning. The IFS has also warned that the government's catch-up fund equates to £100 per pupil per year, well below the £1,600 per pupil being spent in the United States. The warning follows the resignation of Education Recovery Commissioner Sir Kevin Collins, who condemned the £1.4 billion recovery fund for children as far short of what is needed. Public Health England data shows that the Delta COVID-19 variant has affected around 1 in 250 schools. Also known as the Indian variant, the Delta variant has been linked to 97 confirmed COVID-19 outbreaks in primary and secondary schools in the last 4 weeks. Professor Christina Pargle from University College London said that the rise of the Delta variant meant that the government needs to get serious about reducing cases in schools. The Delta variant is more likely to lead to hospitalisations than the Alpha variant first detected in Kent, although the second vaccine dose is likely to help protect against Delta. A pioneering business in Hartlepool has been set up to help prevent gaming addiction in children. Jack Story aims to raise awareness about the dangers of gaming and provide help to youngsters suffering from gaming addiction. Funded by the National Lottery, the business is run by former Hartlepool teacher David Bradley and occupational therapist Charlotte Bell. Mr. Bradley told the Hartlepool Mail that, "We are quite pro-gaming because it's amazing. It's all about the dangers of the unsafe side of it." Teachers Talk Radio is looking for a new weekend newsreader. Email teacherstalkradio@gmail.com for more information. That was your weekend education news with Tom Hopkins-Burke.
Okay, so I'm going to put Emily on the spot now and see whether she can tell us whether there's a particular poem that has a special place in her heart or has a special kind of, a memory for her or a reason why she likes it so much. So Emily.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? I don't know if I'm coming
Yes.
through again.
Yeah,
wonderful.
you are.
Such an impossible
I
question,
know, it's
Fiona.
mean, isn't it?
Absolutely impossible. I think if I was to pick a poem that sort of opened me up to the joys of poetry and its significance in my life, it's probably going to have to be one by Sylvia Plath, who I think it opened up the possibilities for me about, moving away from the sphere of just enjoying the novel to, to reading something that was so profound, but yet sort of simple in the way that it looks, in the way that it sounds. It's so different reading chapters of text to then a few stanzas on a page. And I think I'd say my favorite of hers is Lady Lazarus. It's got such a great message, the imagery is magnificent in it as well. This idea of being reborn, this rebirthing image that she talks about all the way through. But again, I could say the same for some of the poetry from Emily Dickinson. You've mentioned Kate Tempest as well. Hold Your Own is one of my favourite anthology collections of poetry. I read that again and again. I actually picked that up. I remember at the train station when we were on our way to Cambridge, I picked it up for the first time, and I think I must have dented it so much as well, reading it over the years. She's got a fantastic poem as well. I'm trying to think of the name now.
Oh, I've really put you on the spot there.
Clapton Pond at Dawn, beautiful love poem. But yeah, for me, it's always going to be Plath. She's the one that sort of inspired me to, as depressing sometimes as her work might be, at the time as a young 16, 17-year-old with a lot of emotions and nowhere to put them. I think for me, for sure, Sylvia Plath's Lady Lazarus is up there.
Yeah, I mean, I do love Sylvia Plath. I do, as my students will testify. And I know that a few of the other teachers go, oh my God, she's so miserable. But I don't think she is. I think she's very, very interesting. And I know it is kind of, people often associate her with being, a woman's poet. And I do kind of understand that, because she kind of speaks from an angle that perhaps, as you've said, a teenager with emotions and nowhere quite to put them. I do think there is a moment in people's lives when particular poets do seem to speak to them. And that's the beauty of poetry and literature, isn't it? It's when you recognize yourself and you think, oh my God, I did not think that anybody else in the world felt like that. And yet somebody's been able to put it down in words. I think one of my proudest moments is a former student calling her tortoise Sylvia. In fact, actually, she called it Sylvia Tennyson. So she managed to blend them both together. Sylvia Tennyson is still going strong as well. So she often posts pictures of Sylvia kind of perched on her shoulder, probably whispering poetry down her ear. I would imagine that's what the tortoise does. So, but thank you so much, Emily.
Yeah, it's just another point. We were talking a bit before, just then, about finding poets that you can relate to. And I think someone's mentioned, in the comments for this, how do we make poetry more engaging for people? And I suppose it's hard to do that when I'm talking from sort of GCSE. When you were talking about the GCSE curriculum, I was thinking of my anthology Moon on the Tides. It just all came flooding back. But I think for the A level stuff, it was all the classics. It was Shakespeare, it was Poe, it was John Milton. And I think it's hard as a young person to engage in those sorts of works, because you don't see yourself in them. Sylvia Plath might be a woman's poet because she's a woman, maybe same for Kate Tempest and others. And I think maybe it is time to sort of bring that, some of the newer, more contemporary poets into the classroom. I know putting it into the curriculum, might be impossible, might never happen. I think there's a way that we could maybe, bring some of those extra elements in there. I'm thinking of poets like Kate Tempest, Warson Shire, Jay Simpson, all unique people, but with simultaneously really relatable outlooks in poetry that are possibly more likely to engage young person in that poetry, because they're more likely to see themselves in there. I think as long as there's a way that we can make poetry, that's the way in. It's being able to sort of say, gosh, that's me. I can put myself in that situation. But how we do that, it's impossible. I'm not an English teacher. So, keeping up to date with what's going on in the poetry scene is going to be a challenge, on top of learning what's already on the curriculum and getting kids inspired in that way. But I do think if we want to get younger people, and again, I'm talking from my experience of being, in the classroom myself and trying to get inspired, we've got to try and maybe think outside of these anthologies and think about what are the kids actually engaging with. Slam poetry, I think, is on the rise. It has been for, I mean, it started I want to say 80s and that sort of time, but it's something that's still current. It's still going on in the Fringe. It's still a massive part of the Edinburgh scene, which is where I studied in Edinburgh, and I think those methods, Poetry by Heart gives you that opportunity to add that performative element into poetry, which I think makes it more exciting than, say, just writing a poem, submitting it, or just analysing a poem in English lit. So I think there are ways to do it, but how how we make that sort of a national curriculum thing, that's not really something that
No,
that's not my forte. But
it's difficult,
I think for
isn't it?
sure, yeah.
So
I think for
do you
sure
think
there's
that
ways.
songs and raps, do you think that they are a form of poetry, Emily?
It's funny because I'm inclined to say that they are different in the sense that I loved that quote from earlier about it's around poetry is silence, but I think it depends what kind of poetry you're reading and engaging with. I think there are other ways poetry is enjoyed and shared now. The rise of contemporary British performance poetry that you see on the stages of Edinburgh Fringe sort of exemplifies that. It's engaging, it's about audience participation. Now, whether there might be another debate there about whether that is actually poetry in the traditional sense, and whether, I don't want to get into debate like that, but I think there's been I was thinking of maybe rappers like Kendrick Lamar, a great lyricist. Some of his albums and his songs, if you actually started to unpick some of the language used there is a sort of, metaphorical, conceptual thing about rappers and hip hop. And I think there are ways that you can sort of bring elements of rap and song in a comparison sense to poetry. But again, it depends what. I think it depends again. If we're trying to teach kids in the classroom about sort of poetry, do we necessarily want to be teaching them about rap and hip hop, or do we want to be teaching them about
yeah,
it's a tricky one to balance out. I think it's about, I think for me, I enjoy, that's me personally, I enjoyed English literature and poetry. That was my thing through school. So it's easy for me to say, oh, everyone should just read Robert Browning and just get over themselves. But I think for today, especially in secondary school, when it's you have to do the English, you've got to do the literature. How do we get kids excited? It's a difficult question.
It really is, and I think you've been so articulate, and that was really insightful, Emily. The stuff that you've come out with there, I think, is amazing. I'm very proud to have been your teacher, actually. I won't take any credit for the way you've just articulated yourself, but you were amazing. I do think everything you've just said there gets to the crux of what it means to be part of English teaching in the classroom. Whether we are doing them, would we be doing them a disservice? Would we be doing our young people a disservice by saying that we would only teach kind of contemporary poets, or we would try and find a different way in? Are we then denying them access to cultural history, to cultural capital? Do we still need to be in a position where we have to allow that in? But equally, I totally understand this kind of argument that there is a reason why A-level English literature and A-level English language, why the numbers are falling dramatically. And that is something to do, it's got to be something to do with the way that it is being positioned at GCSE, not the way it's being taught at GCSEs, because the teachers are doing their best on a daily basis. But there is something at the moment that is meaning that interest in A-level English has fallen dramatically year on year. And that's really sad. And that is something I think that really needs looking at. There needs to be, somebody having a conversation somewhere about what's going on. Why are these subjects falling? Why are people less interested in them than they once were? And what can we do to change that? It's more than just poetry. I understand that, but there's something going on, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think what I will say is history is always important. History has its roots in everything that we do. And so to just sort of wipe the slate clean, if you will, and just sort of, let's say we're only looking at poets from the last 10 years, I'm not sure that that's the best approach either. Like I said, for me, the work of Emily Dickinson, I even Robert Browning, I quite enjoyed as well. He's not possibly for a young woman the most exciting of the poets, but
oh no, Robert Browning's amazing. He's just I think he transcends time. The stuff that he writes about, kind of the passion and the jealousy and the stuff that is really powerful and really relevant, isn't it?
But that's what I mean. I think poetry, just like anything else, it's all personal preference. It's always going to be, you're always going to have some people in the classroom who's like, this poem's amazing, or this work's amazing. Other people are like, this was boring, this was rubbish. I've had discussions with my peers about, what's it been enjoyable, and some people, they look at a poem, they're just like, I don't get it, I don't see it. And that's always going to be the case. But I think there are ways to make things like poetry intriguing and exciting, and you know, you can do all the curriculum stuff. You can have kids sit in the classroom and go through, you know, I think I'm trying to think back to the GCSE. I think it was some of Simon Armitage's poems. There's some Carol Ann Duffy in there as well, Jackie Kay, I think, as well, from memory. You know, all very great poems, but not poetry at the time that really inspired me to get into it. And I think it was other means and ways, you know, as I got older, you know, slam poetry for me became the thing that I was more interested in the traditional poems. And it's about just giving kids and young people those experiences, like poetry by heart. You know,
Yeah.
I've spoken to people that have been at the competition who were never really interested in poetry until they got to pick a poem for themselves, and, you know, got to really express what that poem meant to them, to other people. So it's experiences like that, I think, that are going to be the way in, you know, having those competitions, and, you know, maybe having the odd a slam poetry thing at the school, you know, those sorts of things are going to be the ways in there.
So the kind of the co-curricular experiences, if you like, allowing.
Yeah, and because I think that, but it's got to be the teachers there, you know, like yourself, that are also excited, also interested, and want to get kids involved in that, you know, and extracurricular, anything outside of the classroom. It's going to depend on, you know, passionate teachers who also want to share that love as well. So as long as you've got those sorts of people teaching and being involved in that, you know, you can't really go far wrong.
Yeah, Emily, you're amazing. Right, I'm going to just go back to Julie and see whether she can add anything about kind of favourite poetry, and also tell us a little bit about how other schools can get involved in Poetry by Heart if this is the first time they've heard of it. So, Julie?
I'll do that bit first, because otherwise I might digress and
Okie dokie.
So Poetry by Heart, the website is poetrybyheart.org.uk, and the information is there. We're on Twitter at Poetry by Heart, and the email is info@poetrybyheart.org.uk, and there's a little register button on the top of the website, top right hand side, and if you register for the 2021-22 competition to get information, then in due course, when I've finished working on it, you will get a poetry calendar for your wall and the competition guide, and that gives you everything you need to know for next year's competition. I don't quite know what the deadlines and stuff are at the moment. We're still working out what the format for next year is going to be, but it is happening, and we'd love any schools to take part. It's from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 5, so just register via the website or give us a shout via one of those means. Favorite poems. It's like, I don't have one favorite poem. Different poems have been important to me at different points in my life, and I've been sitting, listening, and thinking and reflecting on some of the comments there. And the comment about music kind of keeps coming back to me, because I think it's really important to explore. I sometimes think that the debate about, you know, poetry or music is a bit of a false binary, really. Poetry and music. Poetry overlaps all the time. You know, if you think about someone like Robert Burns and his kind of songs, you know, where exactly is the song and where exactly is the poem? It's a tricky one. And one of my early experiences, one of my favourite poets when I was 16 or 17, I suppose, and I really don't come from a house of books. I don't come from a family with any interest whatsoever in poetry, but through radio, I heard Linton Kwesi Johnson, and some of my friends at school had records back in the day, and one of my friends invited me round to her house after school to listen to a Linton Kwesi Johnson. And Linton Kwesi Johnson's a really interesting poet, whose work stands on its own 2 feet as poetry, but also performs often with a full dub band. I had the great honour and privilege of meeting him at a conference a few years ago, and I shook his hand and I was in tears, because he'd been so important to me. His work had been so important when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So different poets find you at different points. So that he was a great influence, and I think for some of the reasons that Emily's talking about, that Linton Kwesi Johnson is an elder now, but at the time he was speaking to me, to the youth of my generation, and that has happened in different ways at different times. It's not a new thing, and so poets find us when we can
can hear them. But I want to go back to the point you made earlier on, Fiona, which was that about turning to poetry in times of joy or sadness. And I sometimes joke a little bit flippantly that we're doing poetry by heart so that we create a generation of children and young people who can do those weddings and funerals really, really well. I like to think we're making a contribution to
Absolutely.
the nation.
Start hiring them out, couldn't we?
Yeah, I have thought about that a few times.
Public poets.
And so 2 poems that really stand out for me are ones that I have recited at funerals. One of those is Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, which I recited at my father's funeral. And more recently at my cousin's funeral, I recited Byron's We'll Go No More a Roving. It's hard choosing a funeral poem, and you get a book that says funeral poems on the cover, and you look at it and you think, oh no, absolutely none of those are any good. You have to feel it. You have to choose from the heart.
Yeah.
And you have to choose something that connects you with the person that you're speaking the poem about or for or whatever. So those poems really stand out in my mind, not least because I had to learn them and then stood up in the crematoria and recited them somehow without falling over because I was so nervous. Yeah, those poems now really are inside me.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think if I think about the poets that I enjoy and that have spoken to me, I think it's for a similar reason. I also read a poem at my dad's funeral, and those kind of things, they stay with you. And as you say, it is not a kind of generic, funeral poems. It is something that connects you to that person and to the life that they led and to the way that you want to remember them. And the fact that somebody else has been able to write down words that speak to you at that moment is really significant. And going back to what Emily said as well, it's kind of this poems speak to you at different times. And I think some of the poets that I really enjoy, I really like Roger McGough. And I know a lot of people kind of dismiss Roger McGough for being a bit of the children's laureate and for writing quite playful stuff. And he does write quite playful stuff, but he also writes some stuff that I use a lot when I'm exploring Marxist theory. He wrote a poem called What Does Your Father Do? And he also wrote a poem called Railings, which are about growing up and being a grammar school boy from a working class family, and him going to university and people asking, what does your father do? Not out of any interest, but so that they could place him, so they could decide whether he was worthy of their attention or not. And his father was a docker. And he thought that if he whispered it or if he said it slightly quietly, they might think that he'd said doctor, and, he would be placed somewhere higher. And it was this embarrassment afterwards and this shame that he felt after his father had died, and the realization that actually he should never have been ashamed of this job that his father had, that he was actually really passionate about. But it's kind of the class division, and the Railings is a really important one for that as well. So things like that really spoke to me when I was growing up. I also really like Edna St. Vincent Millay. I love the poetry that she writes. I tweeted one a few days ago, which was it for this I uttered prayers and sobbed and cursed and kicked the stairs, that now domestic as a plate I should retire at 8:30. That is about getting older and this kind of, wanting to be furious when you're a teenager, kicking the stairs, wanting freedom, but now you've got this freedom, you're domestic as a plate and you want to go to sleep. It's that kind of idea. I just think poetry, I think somebody once said it is prose is an open hand and poetry is a closed fist. And that is definitely how I feel about it. It's got this kind of punch to it, this power to it, that is able to speak to you, sometimes in minimal words, not always. Obviously, there are some epic poems about. I just wonder what you think, anybody else, so Julie or anybody who wants to call in and get involved, or any comments that you want to make about whether as teachers, we need to be teaching the traditional poets, What are our students gaining from that? Do you think that by saying, actually, we're not going to teach these people anymore, we're not going to teach Blake anymore, we're not going to teach, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something like Wordsworth anymore, we're not going to teach the Romantics, do they lose something? Are we doing them a disservice? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start off with a few thoughts. I just think that we should teach broadly and widely. I think that to only restrict things to the most recent poetry, I think it ignores the fact that poetry of the now is in a conversation with the poetry of the past. Obviously, you can't teach everything. You always have to make these selections. But I think thinking about I think the more interesting question to think about is about how poetry keeps changing, how it keeps poets that come in demand new space for their voices to be heard, and you can't really get a sense of that if you don't have a perspective of time. So I do think it's important to teach across time, but I certainly don't think we should only be teaching this or only be teaching that. And I think I think that time matters. But you have to think about what it is that you're trying to teach.
Do you think that we are guilty of only teaching this or only teaching? Do you get what do you understand what I mean? Do you think that there is still a snobbery associated with poetry, and there are still certain poets that we value more than others?
I think it depends on who you mean by we. You know,
I mean the education system, I suppose.
School is very constrained by an assessment system, and
Yeah.
what my research has shown is that the profession always has a lot more agency in it than it thinks it has. My research was only based on what exam boards specified or recommended, but there will have been all sorts of things going on around that, because teachers find creative ways to bring new voices in, to bring new experiences, because they can't, you know, as a teacher, you're constantly trying to think how you can connect with the young people sitting in front of you. So I think it's really important to sort of not get too either or about it.
Which was banned, Julie? Was it Hitcher a few years ago?
It was the one about the knife crime, wasn't it?
Was it one about right, okay. Gosh.
Carol Ann Duffy poem.
Was it Duffy, was it? With the one, well, squashing the fly?
I don't know, maybe there's more than one poem banned.
Yeah. See, I think that's really interesting that was banned over some of the others. Yeah, it was to do with knife crime, wasn't it? We're going back probably, is it more than 10 years?
Time flies.
I'm losing track.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yes, time flies when you're banning poetry in classrooms. Yeah, but I do think there was, but when you think about people like Andrew Marvell and some of the kind of the poetry that we do value, some of that is actually really quite violent and really quite aggressive and really quite misogynistic in a lot of ways. Obviously, we're placing it in its time. I just wonder why this kind of a modern interpretation of a violent act is seen to be more distressing, perhaps, because it's written in language that perhaps our young people access more.
I don't know. I think sometimes these things are a media flash in a pan rather than a serious debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, Julie, what are you working on at the moment?
Poetry by Heart finals in July are occupying a lot of my time, and we've been doing a feature which we only started because of COVID. We've been doing a thing called Poem of the Week, which you can find on the site. It's an email poem with an activity that was designed so that you know, children, perhaps with an adult at home who might take an interest in poetry, could do when they weren't in school. But we like it so much that we're doing that. So I'm busy trying to finish making some more poem selections for that, because it's for the younger age group. And I've also been doing some another research project in the Faculty of Education at Cambridge Education that's all about historic children's books. So it goes beyond poetry. And what we're looking at is the idea that a lot of books have been digitized or are being digitized and put online. But that depends upon how books get valued. And a lot of what gets put up is another 58 editions of Alice in Wonderland or whatever. And what we're working on is how can we diversify digital archives of historic children's books. So we had to do some research, and we had to kind of go back and say, okay, well, historically, because it tends to be historic material that gets digitized, because people want to see it, it's out of print. What were the books that were written for Black children? And we weren't sure when we started what we would find. We found over 500 books. It's scratching. I was going to say scratching an iceberg. That's a really weird metaphor. We're scratching icebergs all over the place. So it's the tip of the iceberg. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And we found some absolutely incredible books that were published, mostly American, because my colleagues that I'm working on the project with run historical libraries in the United States. It's been a bit of a challenge doing research in archives in the United States when you can't actually get on a plane. But we found ways of working together to get around this large problem. And we're just about to build, we're just in the process of building a kind of little website showcase of about 40 books that we found published from late 19th century through the early decades of the 20th century and up to books that are about some from the 1970s, 1980s, and these are all books that are now out of print that are absolutely fantastic and really fascinating books that were published and written for children at that time. I'll give you an example. My favorite one is actually written by the poet Langston Hughes, but it's not a book of poetry. And he wrote, there was a series of books called The First Book of This, The First Book of That. So he also wrote The First Book of the West Indies, and he wrote a children's book all about the West Indies. And they were on all sorts of topics. But he also wrote one called The First Book of Rhythm. And if you want to look at it, you can go on the Internet Archive and borrow it. And it is the best book about rhythm that I've ever read. It's brilliant. It's written for children. And in it, he's got I'm coming back again to this question about poetry and music. He goes way beyond poetry and music, and he says rhythm is in everything. And he shows in this book, he shows children in a way you can really understand how rhythm is in the waves, how rhythm is in the sound of the wind, how rhythm is in so many things around you, and it's also in music, and it's also in poetry. And it's an absolutely fantastic children's book that is out of print, and is just in some libraries where they've managed to keep a copy. My mission is to get everybody to read it, because to teach rhythm in poetry in school is really difficult.
It is.
And all you need to do is give children and young people this book and go, there you are. That's what Langston Hughes, an absolutely brilliant genius poet and
I'm making a note of this.
This is what he says. That's everything you need to know right there.
Perfect, because it is really difficult to teach, but I suppose it is one of our earliest memories are often poetry as well, aren't they? The rhymes that are sung to us as children, they are a form of kind of oral poetry, aren't they?
And they often have a strong rhythmic beat, and he talks about breath, he talks about walking, and he just makes it this really incredibly holistic thing. And I think that book should be brought back into print.
Right, that's our new campaign then. Perfect. I also thought, I think you saw on Twitter that Todd Brennan had put down that he liked to recite poetry when he was on long runs. I thought that was brilliant. He's going to do a piece for you, isn't he?
He's going to do a piece for our blog. We already have a piece for the blog about long distance walking and reciting poetry, which is nice. And many poets compose poetry while walking. William Wordsworth did. The contemporary poet Alice Oswald, she walks and composes poetry, so it's less of a written thing and more of a bodily thing. And certainly when I'm learning a poem, in order to speak it by heart, I have to walk it to get it.
So you find the rhythm.
I find the rhythm with my feet.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I've never thought about, because obviously I do run, probably not as well as Todd runs, and probably not as fast. But the idea of being able to recite a poem as you're moving up a hill, I could see why that would work for those very reasons. That idea of kind of finding the rhythm, finding the speed, finding the breath. And I suppose that fits in with the Langston Hughes idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, that it's all connected. It's all part of our whole life, and
Yeah.
everything connects to it, because our heartbeat and our breathing, they're all rhythmic things.
Mm. So what to you, just if we go back to Poetry by Heart for a minute, because I think when Emily was talking about, she was also a drama student, but I think the beauty of Emily's performance was that it wasn't a kind of dramatic, over the top performance. The beauty was it was in the modulation and the kind of tone and the subtle changes of face. What do you think makes a winning recitation? Is that too difficult a question?
I know exactly the answer to that.
Okay.
The winning recitation is always the one where the hairs on the back of my neck go up.
Aha.
It's quite simple, but that's not how. I'm not a judge, so I don't get to choose. The judges judge, and they're looking for all sorts of things. They're looking for the way that the young person was really inside the poem, that they are speaking the poem to us. They've owned it, and they've understood it, and it's their poem that they're giving back to us, and that's hard to kind of specify particularly. They want to.
Do you ever feel that they don't hear what you hear?
Well, the judges are all quite different, and so they hear different things, which is always really, really interesting. And we like to do it so that they have a big argument about who should win.
Yeah. Good. Just like the Eurovision Song Contest then.
It wouldn't be any fun otherwise, would it?
Absolutely not. No.
Because there isn't one right way of doing it. There's not one right recitation. We want things that we want interpretations that make the judges stop. And actually, the one thing that they generally say when they finally come to their decision about who the winners are, they like recitations where even when it's a poem that they've read like 36,000 times, where the young person makes them hear it as if it was for the first time.
Yeah.
That they just bring something to it that makes them stop and go, I didn't think of that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Julie. So we are coming up towards the end of the show. You have been, both of you, Julie, Emily, thank you so much for coming on and being my first guests on my first show, because honestly, I've spent all day like a ball of anxiety and thinking, oh my God, why have I done this? Why have I agreed to this? So you have made it so much easier. You've been wonderful. You've been insightful, you've been passionate, and I couldn't have asked for better guests. So I really do appreciate your time. And Poetry by Heart, absolutely get involved. If you are a primary teacher, a secondary teacher, it's something that the students, from my experience, absolutely love, and you see a completely different side to them. And you as a teacher as well, or a librarian, or whoever else it is who gets involved in the school, has really, really, it's a really enjoyable experience. It's something that gives you a kind of appreciation of what it means to be involved in young people and creativity. So I do think if you've not seen it before, definitely go and have a look on the website. So I am going to sign off in the next couple of minutes, but thank you once again. I hope you've all had a wonderful half term. I hope you've all enjoyed the sunshine, those people who are in the UK, and I hope you've managed to have a little bit of downtime after the 3 years that was the last half term. So in my 20 odd years of teaching, honestly, it has been memorable, let's call it that. And hopefully we won't have to experience it again. So I hope you've all had some downtime. I hope you've all had a few drinks or a few nice meals. I hope you've managed to reacquaint yourselves with what it means to have a social life, talking to people, meeting up with friends, going out for walks, whatever it is that makes you happy, running up a hill while reciting some poetry. So I hope that Monday and going back to school is not too dreadful. I hope the Sunday night doom and the kind of sleepless nights which seem to, no matter how much we love teaching, I still think it kind of comes to us all. I think we all lie there awake a little bit and worrying about the fact that maybe we could have done a little bit more, but we didn't want to because it was sunny. So hopefully you have a wonderful week ahead of you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for getting involved. And thank you once again to Julie and Emily for being the best guests I could possibly ask for. Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.